Hi, this is Dr. Nadine Rosechild Sullivan, and I am teaching social stratification. And so, in talking about the sociology of social justice and in talking about social stratification, it is important that we cover a number of things. We already have two videos in which we have looked at some of the issues, some of the founding background histories of social stratification by race. And this is June 14th when I'm making this video, June 14th, 2020. But it is also Pride Month. And so in speaking about social stratification, it's important also that we talk about social stratification by sexual orientation and gender identity. And I can't possibly get to all of that in one video, but I will get to some of it and I'll get to more in others. And so let's see where this takes us tonight. I want to say again that a lack of historical knowledge is a real disadvantage to any sort of analysis, right? Any sort of understanding of the world around us. If we don't know where we have been, then we can't know where we are and we can't decide where we're going. That whole thing about history repeating itself, history repeats itself when it is not viewed, known, understood, analyzed, and when we don't make different choices, right? If we think about the way people parent, oftentimes we end up parenting on autopilot because we haven't thought through how we were raised and how we actually believe in raising someone. And so also as a species, we need to think through what's gone on before us, before we were here. We need to study and learn to know some of that. We are a thinking species and we can make choices that make things different. So we want to know where we want to go from here. Therefore, we have to know some of where we were, and we have to know some of where we are. So as I speak to you tonight, I speak to you on the with a recognition that this week has been the sad occasion of another murder in Philadelphia, where I'm sitting tonight, in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, of a Black trans woman. There have been any number of hate crime murders of gay and trans people, of LGBTQ people in Philadelphia across the decades that I've been studying this space and this phenomenon. And so I did my dissertation on the social movement of the gay marriage movement, and I did my dissertation in living in Philadelphia, studying some New Jersey because it was a contest, a battleground state for a number of reasons, but also just being aware of what's been going on in Philadelphia. And so a woman by the name of Dominique was found on 6/9 at 7 p.m. in the, it's unclear from the news articles whether she was on the banks of the Schuylkill River or in the Schuylkill River, but she was found horribly murdered, and in the tradition with which trans people tend to be murdered, she was also mutilated. Her legs were cut off. And so I should have said trigger warning before telling you that. I'll put it in the description. But you know, she had facial and head injuries as well. And so this is part of this history here in this city, and it's not all better yet. And so we need to know some of where we have been to see is some things are better and some things are clearly not better. It's certainly not all better. So this being Pride Month, how did we get here? Where are we now? So if we rewind the history is that same-sex orientation. So when we talk about same-sex orientation, we're talking about not only a sexual orientation, not only who people are attracted to, but also who people bond with. It's an affectional orientation. So it's who do people want to partner with and spend their life with? Who do they fall in love with? So it's far bigger. It's not a fetish. It's an orientation toward people. And some people are, and I don't have time to go and break all of that down in this video, but some people are clearly oriented toward those of another sex than them. They're clearly straight by our society's definition. Other people are clearly and entirely, as far as anyone can tell, same-sex oriented and only attracted to and only fall in love with or romantically attracted to and want to partner with people of their own sex/gender. And some people are attracted to both, and some people are attracted to all. So there are people who identify as bisexual, people who identify as pansexual. I'll let you go to the internet to look some of that up, and we'll talk about that another time. But in the history of all this, everything except complete heterosexuality, everything except those who were classed as male and female, be assigned male and female at birth, those the doctor looked between their legs, saw male and female genital parts, assigned them as that sex, and they lived their lives with a internalization of that as well, and attracted to the opposite, quote, opposite, air quotes, opposite of that. Only those people were viewed as all that God created, right? So there was a theological view first. If we go back just a little while, rewind 100 and some years, we're looking at a world in which any view of same-sex attraction or affectional or sexual attraction was simply viewed as sin. That's all there was. This was theology. It is a theology still held by many. It is held still by most denominations of Christianity, by many, not all, but some sects of Judaism, by, I'm not a scholar on Islam, but, and I know that there are many moderate and progressive Muslims, but certainly there are some branches, some spaces in Islam where it is definitely not okay to be same-sex oriented. And so all of that, right? And not just that, if we talk about Hinduism or Buddhism or whatever kind of religious background that one can think of, arguably, we could talk about what existed or didn't exist in paganism back through time. Probably we could exempt paganism from this discussion, but most religious perspectives, certainly patriarchal religious perspectives, have viewed same-sex attraction, same-sex affectional or sexual attraction as sin. And so we come into the United States, and we come into a country that is theoretically constructed as having a separation between church and state. So while it doesn't say that exactly, it does say that the state shall make no law assigning, the words are escaping me at the moment, assigning a religious belief or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, right? It shall not establish, that's the word. The state cannot establish a religion, and it cannot prohibit the free exercise of religion. And therefore, there's a separation of the democracy, theoretically at least, and constitutionally, certainly, separation of the state from the church. And therefore, the government of the United States does not regulate churches. When churches incorporate in order to get tax-exempt status, the state still, even at the state, one of the 50 states level, does not tell them what to believe or who can be ordained or can't be ordained. In some denominations, every male is considered a minister and no females. In other denominations, if we take the Quakers, every party in the congregation, every friend is considered to be of equal rank there, and at least the Hicksite Quakers. And so there are other spaces in which there are certain paths to ordination, certain kinds of schooling and seminaries, and the Catholic Church has a tradition of the laying on of hands and the anointing with holy oil of the fingers of the priest, all of those spaces. So the state stays out of all of that. But there's still this commonly held belief system as this nation is founded, that, and as, our societies, our Western societies and our European societies are founded, that same-sex attraction, affectional or sexual, is sin. Then in comes one of the main changes that come into this is the advent of psychology. So we begin to have some influences. We have Sigmund Freud, who begins to hypothesize that maybe everybody is sort of same-sex attracted at one point, and then you become more mature and adjusted if you become other sex attracted, but that there's maybe some space for youthful bisexuality, but you should certainly mature into heterosexuality. But there also begins to be this concept, once it's taken out of the realm of religion, that there comes to be a concept of a kind of person. There was a German sexologist by the name of Magnus Hirschfeld, who began to study. He was an MD, and he began to study people. He opened an institute for human sexuality. He began to try to help families not have more children than they could afford, but he also was he was a closeted gay man who could not afford to live. He couldn't afford to have a partner. He couldn't afford to live his life out or openly. So he lived celibate, but he recognized himself as same-sex oriented, as same-sex attracted. And he studied people who were LGBTQ, right? He studied people who were intersex, and he studied people who were transgender, and he studied people who were same-sex attracted or bisexual, and wrote about it. And unfortunately, he was out of the country, but as Hitler came to power, Magnus Hirschfeld had worked very hard to get a German law struck down. I believe it was paragraph 175, to get it struck down to allow there to be same-sex liaisons were illegal. And so he was trying to get that changed. He did manage to get a law passed in Berlin that if you were transgender, or you wanted to cross-dress, that you could cross-dress, and you could carry, if you put your name on this registry, you could dress in the clothing of the, quote, other sex, and the police weren't supposed to be able to harass you. But when Hitler rose to power, the Hitler Youth broke in and stole Magnus Hirschfeld's physician's records from his Institute of Sexuality, and then they arrested those men as homosexual and put them in the concentration camps, made them wear a pink triangle, which is where you sometimes see that symbol for gay people, and put many to death. So I believe there were about 1 million in the concentration camps. And so also we follow Magnus Hirschfeld and his work. Alfred Kinsey comes onto the scene in America. He is studying sexuality of all kinds. He does a massive qualitative, not quantitative, but a massive qualitative study. He and his team interview over 18,000 people about every thought or fantasy or experience they'd had in their lifetimes, and they amass a large data base, and he writes 2 books, one on male sexuality, one on female sexuality. He hypothesizes also that there are kinds of people, that there are some people who are naturally gay and some people who are naturally bi, and he finds large numbers. He comes up with a scale, and we're from 0 to 6, and he comes up with a large number of people who fit into these various categories, and a bell curve to it. Along this time, there is a man, Henry Gerber, who is in the United States military during World War, maybe it wasn't a World War, in the he comes back, and he's here in the 1930s. So he had been overseas. When he comes back in the 90s, he'd been to Berlin, and he'd seen some of that work. And he felt relatively free. And when he came back to the United States, he tried very hard to found the first gay organization and to get other gay men to fight with him for their civil rights, and this view of being a minority group, of being a kind of person. Henry Gerber worked for the US Post Office. His home was broken into. He had sent out one newsletter, and his files were taken. He was accused of conduct unbecoming of a postal worker and fired from his job, and put out of business. So that was the end of his organization. But his thought life is then also followed. In the 1950s, you get you have a lot of changes. In the 1930s and 40s and 50s, you have a couple of factors going into play. You get the passage of a lot of vice laws. So from the 30s through the 50s, state after state after state, municipality after municipality are passing laws outlawing sodomy, air quotes, sodomy. So sodomy being conceived of by them as either sex between 2 men. They included oral and anal sex in that conception often. And in some states, it included heterosexual couples and heterosexual married couples even. But there's this passage of all of these laws. And with that, police departments begin to put into effect vice squads that then go out, and they pass also, there's a lot of laws passed that forbid gay people to congregate together, forbid there to be a place in which, you know, 2 or 3 apparently gay men or lesbian women, or, you know, cross-dressing or transgender, what we would, whether they considered themselves trans at that point is a different conversation, but people who we would now class as transgender, you know, whether they were allowed to congregate. And so that was forbidden. And so gay bars were forbidden. Yet at the same time, there's this space happening with World War II in which the American military begins to do psychological testing, use psych evals as you're entering the military. So everybody's volunteering to go fight Hitler and to go fight the Japanese that had bombed Pearl Harbor. So everybody is you know, volunteering to go fight in World War II. And those young men and women who are coming out of the middle of the country and the heartland and the small towns and villages and the rural areas and the cities, as they're coming in and they're enlisting en masse into the armed services, they're being given psychology tests that ask them, and they're being asked about their sexual orientation. And a lot of people who had simply been pressured into spaces where they would have lived on the down low, would have married heterosexually, would have had children, maybe would have lived in a closeted life, maybe would have secretly longed but never acted, maybe would have acted quietly, whatever that was, they began to question, wait, am I this kind of person? And so young people enlisting in the military were being asked to assess their own sexual orientation. And of course, if that was a same-sex orientation or in any way not a cisgendered orientation, identity, they were then being excluded from the armed services. Yet many people got in, many people answered the questions in ways that allowed them to join the service. And then when people were, it's a world war, as the troops from the United States are going around the globe and are fighting in these spaces, when they would get some rest and relaxation, they'd be in coastal port cities. And so there's this entire rise of gay bars all around the globe, really. But you get it, particularly if we're thinking of the United States, you get it in New York, you get Philadelphia, you get Miami, you get San Francisco and LA, you get these port cities where gay bars arise, but the gay bars are being made illegal, and there's police vice squad. So police officers are either going undercover and trying to entrap often gay men into some sort of sexual interaction so they can arrest them, or they are raiding the gay bars and, you know, night sticking people and, you know, shutting it down. And if you got arrested in a gay bar raid, your name and face would be put in the newspaper, and you know, your private life would be destroyed, you'd be fired from your job, your family would disown you, you'd be shamed in front of everyone, and just, you know, this entire something. So as all of that is happening, there's also there's also the passage of a lot of, the law of sodomy laws around the country, so that pretty much every state begins to outlaw, you know, sodomy and gay congregating and all of that. So then what happens with that is there's this recognition that, like, wait, maybe gay people are saying, maybe we're a kind of person. And so there are 2 organizations that arise in the early 50s. The Mattachine Society for Men started as a gay male social organization, and the Daughters of Bilitis, or Bilitis, never sure how to say it, for women, started by Del Martin and Phyllis Lyon, begin as these social organizations. They do begin to put out small magazines. They are breaking the Comstock laws, which forbid mail, so they're having to mail things furtively under, you know, in brown paper wrappers and not get caught for what they're mailing. But they're mailing and little pamphlet-like magazines that are saying, you know, I'm this kind of person, and I desire the company of other people of my sex, and I desire to spend my time in you know, with this, and this is like a people group. And so from that there arises an identity, right? So an identity as a group of people, that combination of psychology, of the passage of all these laws that are discriminatory, and then also on top of this, these social organizations and some of the leaders of these social organizations become more radical, so that Harry Hay, who helps found the Mattachine Society, begins to really argue, no, we're a minority group. And as a minority group, we need to stand together. Now, at this moment in time, also, the Black civil rights movement is hitting the news. Black civil rights movements had pre-existed the moment when they hit the news in the 1950s, but this is happening in public space, and so this is also firing the thought of other people groups. It's firing the thoughts of women's rights groups being revived. It's firing also this thought life of Harry Hay, and in the Daughters of Bilitis in Philadelphia, Barbara Giddings rises up as a leader. Frank Kameny is a gay man who was a federal employee in that window of time. He's fired for being gay, and he begins to sue for the rights of gay men or gay people to be employed in the federal government. He loses that lawsuit, but still it's a part of the growing consciousness, and people like Frank Kameny and Barbara Giddings put together, there's an affiliation made called East Coast Homophile Organization, or ECHO, in which they begin to say, wait, we need to fight for our rights. We need to fight for our rights as a minority group, as a kind of person. We are gay people, and we are being discriminated against, and we're being hounded by the police. We're being assaulted in our places of social life. We're being followed. We're being arrested. We're being publicly shamed in the newspaper. We have to fight back. And so as we move into 1965, the East Coast Homophile Organization, ECHO, begins to hold an annual day of remembrance on July 4th, 1965, 66, 67, 68, and 69. They gather together and they hold signs, and they decide they should dress very gendered appropriate for the 1950s. So the women have to wear skirts and blouses or dresses, because women didn't wear pants back then. So even, no matter how they may have identified as a more masculine lesbian, they were still being pressed into wearing skirts or dresses for this event. But they would have been also in their work life, their school life, there was no wearing of pants. If you look at some of the old television, you even see women gardening in shirt dresses, right? Like, you didn't wear pants for much other than horseback riding at some point in time. And so so the women have to wear like that. The men have to wear suits and ties, and it's July 4th in Philadelphia. That can be kind of hot, but they're wearing suits and ties and dresses, and they're marching around in front of Independence Hall. And they're holding signs basically saying, I am a human being, right? I deserve equal rights. And so they grow from just a handful of people in 1965 into a relatively large group of people in 1969, but things are happening elsewhere. There's an uprising, a resistance at the Black Cat bar in San Francisco. There is a resistance at Compton's cafeteria out there, also in California. There is a sit-in demonstration at a cafeteria in Philadelphia because gay people aren't allowed to congregate, and somebody tries to move them out, and so they sit in, they begin to enact. And by this point now, as we've gotten into the 60s, by now the anti-Vietnam protest movement has really, that peace movement has really arisen, and there begin to be, by 69, it's gone from hundreds to hundreds of thousands of people demonstrating against the war in Vietnam. And so all of these movements are sparking, right? And as they're sparking, then also this space is sparking. So what happens in June of 1969, July 4th, 1969, ECHO still marches in front of Independence Hall in Philadelphia, and there is a blue historic marker to that purpose now. But we just days before that final ECHO march, in late June of 1969, the police raid again the Stonewall Inn, a little tiny dive of a gay bar in Greenwich Village on Christopher Street. They raid the Stonewall Inn, and the patrons who are being harassed by the police resist. And so, to the best of my digging, what happens is they're being taken out, they're being cuffed, put into police paddy wagons, you know, and going to be transported. The whole same thing that always happens is going to happen again. And as this is happening, a butch lesbian by the name of Stormy Laveray begins to, and she's relatively butch. In today's world, she may or may not have identified as a trans man. To the best of my research, she identified as a lesbian at that point in time in 1969. And so she resists, and she calls out to those standing around to help, and she's resisting being put into the squad car, paddy wagon, whatever. She may have thrown a punch at a police officer. This bar is also filled with, it's got a very young crowd, it's got a relatively poor crowd, it has a crowd, there's a lot of Black and Latinx, transgender people, or what would, you know, today's terminology has changed some, but there are people there who we would identify as transgender today, and there are people who identify as gay men. It's largely a gay male slash transgender space, not a lesbian space. Lesbians did tend to have their own bars more at that point in time. And so they begin to resist, they begin to take off their high heels, those of them that have them, and to fight the police. And at some point, they actually drive the police into the Stonewall Inn, and or keep those who are in there in, and they manage to lock some police officers in, and they then try to set the Stonewall on fire with the police officers inside. Rioting is breaking out, and they riot for 3 days in Greenwich Village in 1969, and it's being covered, you know, in the press, and it sparks around the nation. And so it's just this time of social movement, right? It's this time in which Black people have marched and protested in peaceful, nonviolent ways. Martin Luther King has been killed. The cities in the United States were on fire in 1965, in 1967, 1968, after Martin Luther King's death. There, you know, the Black Power movement is rising. There's, you know, there's resistance. There's that there. There's the anti-Vietnam War protesters. In the spring of 1970, a few months later, 4 white students are killed at Kent State. A few days after that, I believe it was after, and I think it was an 11-day gap, students at Jackson State University are shot by National Guard. So, you know, there's this murder of students who are protesting the war in Vietnam, or in the case of Jackson State, they're protesting segregation in the, I think, what was local bowling alley. So all of this is going on, and this gay movement is then also resisting, and in its resistance, within a year's time, all across the country, literally hundreds of organizations, either called GAA for Gay Activist Alliance, or GLF for Gay Liberation Front, spring up all over the country. There's also a group that rises up called Radical Lesbians, and there's just this sparking of this gay social movement. So it's got its origins back with Henry Gerber. It's got its origins with Harry Hay, I'm sorry, and it's got its origins with Barbara Giddings and Echo and Frank Kameny. But now it has sparked, and it has turned into this full-blown, you know, conflagration, this rebellion, and with it, there begins to be the call out of the closets and into the streets. And so all these gay organizations that are suddenly springing up are calling to other gay people and saying, Barbara Giddings used to have to make a choice. Do I show my face on TV or not? If they want to interview me, do I, you know, make them cover me with a little, you know, fuzzy spot so nobody can tell? Do I use my real name? And then it's just comes to the point, it's like, I'm using my real name, I'm coming out of the closets and into the streets. And so there's this shift in LGBT consciousness that happens at this moment in time in 1969. And with it, there is also the rise of gay community centers, one of which still exists in Philadelphia, though I don't know what year it actually started as it exists now, but there's a rise of women's centers around the country as part of the second wave women's movement and the fight for the Equal Rights Amendment. And some of them begin to include lesbian groups in their meeting lists. And there's also this fight against police entrapment and harassment, and a demand demand that the bar raids end. And of course, that's an ongoing contest, but it does begin to make a difference. There's a beginning of, there's a very strong fight in this window of time for anti-discrimination laws to be passed. And they're being passed municipality by municipality, little town, little village, little city, little county, you know, rarely a state. But there is this fight for these anti-discrimination laws to be passed. We still do not have any sort of federal anti-discrimination law. There is no Employment Non-Discrimination Act, and there is not an anti-discrimination law nationally for gay people or trans people or any of the LGBTQIA list of letters. So there is a fight against the sodomy laws. Did I mention the rise of the gay press? So the Philadelphia Gay News still exists here. The Advocate rises up. So there's and there's also the use of self-publishing by a lot of lesbian and women's rights organizations happening out there. The women and the men are pretty separate at this moment in time. They kind of come together with the AIDS crisis more than, you know, than existed before it. There's a rise of legal organizations. Lambda Legal follows the model of the NAACP. So Lambda Legal, like the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, begins to look for court cases they can bring up through the courts and keep appealing and appealing and appealing, hopefully to get to the US Supreme Court and to make some changes. There's the rise somewhere along the journey of, probably not till the 1980s, but the rise of the Human Rights Campaign, HRC. They join that out of the closets into the street call with a National Coming Out Day initiative, where every year they're asking gay people to come out, tell your stories, talk, tell what you've gone through. So there's this beginning of this long fight. There's a long fight in the courts and with legislatures. There's a long fight. There's, in every social movement, there are two arms. There is, in any social movement, the legal arm, where you're fighting to get legislatures to pass laws, where you're forward to strike down laws, and where you're fighting for court rulings, right? So you're doing this piece over here for the legal part. And on the other side, there's the social movement. There's the telling of your narratives, the telling of what life is like for you, the telling of those stories, which helps to shift the public consciousness and then put pressure on legislatures and judges and courts to decide in your favor. So if you establish your humanity in the public sphere, ultimately the legal must follow. On the other hand, if you establish your humanity in a legal sense, you see the public follow, which we saw with the fight for marriage. Once marriage became legal in the United States, which was only June of 2015, so 5 years ago right now. As we look at 5 years, up until 5 years ago, when that final court ruling by the US Supreme Court had not yet happened, Obergefell versus Hodges, until that ruling, which struck down the Federal Defense of Marriage Act and allowed and made it national that gay people had the right to marry same-sex partners. Until that moment in time, there is not this recognition of same-sex marriage or same-sex couples, and certainly not even of same-sex individuals, same-sex oriented individuals, as being fully human, as being entitled to civil rights in the United States. So there's that shift. It is the same kind of shift that happens when women get the vote. So that legal thing makes a difference in the eyes of the public, which is where we're living now, right? Is that overwhelmingly most people have become at some level LGBTQIA affirming. That has only happened because of that ruling and in these 5 years. But it's also happened, and that ruling happened because of all that telling your narratives, National Coming Out Day initiative kinds of pressures. So in 2004, the sodomy laws were struck down finally. I think there were a number of states that still had it. I meant to look it up. I think there were like 17 states, but you can Google it too, that still had sodomy laws on the books. At the time of the 2004 Lawrence versus Texas ruling of the US Supreme Court, that made same-sex sex legal in the United States between consenting adults for the first time in all states. And though some states still keep those laws on their books, they are no longer valid because there's a national determination by the Supreme Court that those are unconstitutional. In the same way as we come forward, and I might have mentioned this when we were talking about race, but there was a Hate Crimes Act that President Obama signed into law called the Matthew Shepard James Byrd Jr. Act, or they may have switched that. It might be James Byrd Jr. Matthew Shepard Act, but the Hate Crimes Act, which I think was 2009, was signed into law. So there are many, many states that still do not have hate crime statutes, but there is still this national hate crimes legislation that needs to be used. Arguably in some of the cases of murder of unarmed civilians. I would argue that the case of Ahmaud Arbery's murder and also of George Floyd's murder should both be tried under under the Hate Crimes Act, but or that should be a piece of the charges. It's not just murder. When you murder someone for being who they are, then you speak to their entire public group. You speak to that entire minority group that they're part of. And so it is an act that extends beyond the individual. It's not, I had a fight with this person and I shot them because I was mad at them. It becomes, I shot them because they fit this minority group category, or I, in some other way, murdered them for this, and I am sending a message out beyond them to everybody in their group. And so that law mattered, right, and does matter. But as I said, there's still no federal anti-discrimination act or employment non-discrimination act, which means there are still places where you can be fired for being LGBTQIA. There are certainly religious organizations with the right, because of the separation of church and state, with the right to hire or not hire or to fire somebody that they discover to be LGBTQ if they figure that fits into their if that's something that their religion in their estimation prohibits them approving of. And so there's that space, and there are things happening in that space. But setting that aside for the moment, there's also just simply Pennsylvania, where I'm sitting right now, is a fire at will state. Philadelphia as a city has it has an employment non-discrimination act, but it only would include government employees, right? It does not extend to every business in Philadelphia. And it certainly does not extend to the state of Pennsylvania. And so, at least last time I checked, there is no law in the state of Pennsylvania that forbids someone being fired simply for being LGBT. So they could have been, working somewhere 30 years and then be discovered to fit into this category. And with that, then be fired for no other cause than simply their employer, or maybe there was a shift in management and a new supervisor, but somebody discovered they were, they had a same-sex partner, or they had a same-sex history, or they, had a gender identity that was non-conforming in some way that people had not realized prior, and therefore they can absolutely simply be fired without cause, just fire at will. So there are other pieces to be talked about. There's more to be talked about, certainly in regard to hate crimes. There is more to be talked about in regard to the actual fight for same-sex marriage and what that included and didn't include. There's more to be talked about in the fight for transgender rights. Clearly, we are not there yet. As I mentioned, Dominique Fels was murdered this week in this city for being transgender. And that can clearly be seen even in the way she was murdered. And so with that, this is much, some things are much better. They got made better by the 2015 US Supreme Court over Geffelbert versus Hodges ruling. And prior to that, there was a Winslow versus United States ruling that fed into that. Those cases made gay people, made same-sex oriented people who fall in love with or marry or are primarily sexually attracted to their own sex/gender, made those people more full citizens and more included in civil rights, though not protected from discrimination. And so a lot of that's still up in the air. A lot of that's still riding on the Equal Rights Amendment, and other pieces of things that need to happen. But clearly transgender rights are by no means secured and are a very contested space. In the spring of 2019, President Trump undid some Obama era executive orders that had to do with transgender people and their welcomeness in the US military. There had been a fight for, actually, gay people were being kicked out of the military for being gay. Under Don't Ask, Don't Tell. So I hadn't mentioned that. So Don't Ask, Don't Tell had been struck down, and gay people had the right to be in the military, and trans people were being included in that right. And then there was this shift, and then that went to court, and then the courts ruled in Trump's favor. And so in 2019, in the spring of 2019, he began to routinely have transgender people removed from the military, that is ongoing at this moment in time. And so there's a lot of contest still for safety, for public access to public spaces, for transgender people have no secured rights to employment, to safety or health, or peace and merit, to bodily integrity, to any of those things at this point in time. So there is a lot still to be fought for, a lot on the table. But this is some of the social stratification that has existed historically. If we're looking at socioeconomic class status, as we are a lot in regard to social stratification, overwhelmingly, lesbian women have been somewhat impoverished and have tended to couple later in life. So in more recent times, because there is more gay and lesbian acceptance, that people are coming out at younger ages. Historically, lesbian women tended to come out after having been pressured by society into marriage. If we go back 4 decades, you really didn't have good ways to, most women in the United States weren't managing to get an education beyond high school, weren't managing to get careers. They might have gotten jobs after high school, but they were overwhelmingly minimum wage jobs. Whole the conversation about what percentage of our workforce is still in that space. But there were very, very few women, no matter their race, that were in, or even with white privilege, that were in careers. And so there's a shift in that across that space and time. But women who were coming out as gay or as lesbian in the 60s or 70s or 80s were coming out usually after marriage, had been societally pressured into marriage, maybe had not really questioned their sexual orientation, and then were married, had children, ended up at some point leaving that marriage with their children, ended up acknowledging to themselves that they were same-sex oriented, and if they then partnered with another woman, those two women would end up raising children together, sometimes from one or both partners, and oftentimes, with two female wages, in an era where a dual wage became a necessity for a family and a couple. And but gay men tended to recognize that they were, men who were primarily gay tended to recognize that sooner even then. So most gay men were coming out to themselves in their teenage years as being gay, and asking the question and acknowledging that to themselves in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, that is, happening there. But there's still not a lot of social space. But if they did end up in same-sex partnerships, gay men would often end up with more money because they would often end up with not having children to raise. And so they'd have two male wages. So there's a socioeconomic class status difference historically between gay male and lesbian women couples. Some of that continues, some of that is changing. But that is, still part of the factor that's there. People who are raising kids, most of the people I know who have traveled a lot prior to COVID-19 were people who didn't have kids, because when you have young children and grade school and high school and college age children, somehow having children takes your money. And so you do a lot less, and least until retirement. Whereas those who don't have children tend to have more expendable cash in some way or another. So that said, I will wrap this up for tonight. But again, there is social stratification in our society based on being lesbian, gay, bisexual, or pansexual, transgender, intersexed, we've not really discussed, but included in the LGBTQIA umbrella. So lesbian, LG, gay, bisexual, T, transgender, Q, queer identified or questioning, I, intersexed, asexual. So in all of that space, there has been discrimination, and some things are better, some things aren't better, and it's just really good to recognize, you know. So, and also let me add that if someone is coming out today, they're still facing a couple of questions, right? One is, what's my family of birth going to think? Like, do I have a religious background? Does my religion forbid this still? Was I raised believing it was sin because that's still out there? Or was I raised in a way where that's not not an issue? I was raised in one of the few denominations that affirm LGBT plus people, or I was, you know, I was raised more secularly. Like, what does that look like for any given individual? Any friend of yours, yourself, any family member, anybody you know who's facing the question of their sexual orientation or gender identity is facing, like, what's the religion? What's my family of origin, the people I love and need most, going to think of me? What will my friends think of me? What will it mean in my job, in my education, in my ability to make my way forward in the world? For some people, things have been much improved by the 2015 same-sex marriage ruling. For some people, it doesn't begin to touch their issues. And so just recognizing that, you know, there's still a whole lot of ground in this. And then there are people out there, even for those that, you know, feel relatively free, there are haters out there, and there's public conversation. There's still religion being used as politics in our nation when we're supposed to be a secular, pluralistic democracy where the state does not establish a religion. And we still have many people trying to establish their religion as the religion of the United States. And were they to do that for LGBTQIA people, it could look like Handmaid's Tale. And certainly for women's rights to their own body, it would look like Handmaid's Tale. So, you know, just saying. So I'm going to let you go for now. And I hope that you are enjoying the class and social stratification, where we've been, where we are now, and where we want to go, to true freedom and liberty for all human beings of all backgrounds, whether they are straight and cisgendered, or whether they are in some way other than straight and other than cisgender in their identity. Cisgender meaning that your identification of yourself as male or female lines up with what the doctor said when they looked between your legs at birth. So we're assuming you were not intersexed when we say that. We're assuming you were born with non-ambiguous genitalia, that your assignment of sex lined up with your chromosomes, that your mind lines up with that, and that you feel contentedly, whatever you were declared, male or female, that you feel that, and that you are then contentedly attracted to people of the other designation as far as sex of body goes, right, and gender identity goes. And everyone else doesn't fit into that and comes under this LGBTQIA umbrella. So be well, and I will talk to you soon. And